Yeah, it's your boy Chill here. Welcome back to ROM hacking. Today is a little bit different because we are going to be adding a feature to the UI of the game, which is quite a bit different story than changing calculations. It's a lot more annoying, let me tell you that. So what's the problem? What are we trying to improve here? Let me show you. We got a battle going here. Let me move this guy out of the way so he doesn't get killed right away. I'm gonna do some magic. Okay, so now it's the magic user's turn again, and they have another spell, I want to use it, but I used the last one, it removed it from the slot, there's nothing there. So how do you get access to the other spell? Well, first you just hit pause, you go into the inventory. Then you go into the inventory, or you go into the menu, then you go into the inventory, then you go down here, you select from all the spells that you would have, you would find the one you wanted, you would select it, you would bind it to the slot, then you would exit the inventory screen, then you exit this screen, and then you can use the spell, and then you can target an enemy. So, I don't like that. That's very annoying. That is, in my opinion, what I would term, I think the technical term for that is bullshit. So, I want to improve it. I want to improve that flow. I don't want to have to do that every time I want to use a different spell. It's so goddamn annoying. So what am I going to do? So I had some ideas about how I wanted to improve that. Like maybe I would add a feature so that it automatically equips a different spell once you've used, a spell up. It'll equip a new one in here, but it's hard to decide, well, which one is the user going to want to use next? It could be any of them, so that's probably not super useful. So here's what I've settled on. If slot 2 is empty and you press the action button, it will automatically take you not to the menu, but directly to the inventory for that character. And then you can select a spell. When you select the spell, it will equip it, and it will automatically take you, not to the menu, back to the combat, and it will automatically activate that spell, because if you equipped it, you're going to want to use it, right? And so I call this new feature the Spellbook. And it's going to be nice. And when you're in that there'll be some little other features in there, but it's going to use the existing inventory screen, but in a new kind of special mode for selecting only spells. So that's what we're going to do, but there's a lot to figure out. So the first thing I need to figure out is, okay, well, where exactly is the code for the inventory? Where does that live? And it's kind of tricky to figure that out. How do I find that exactly? Because, if I go into the inventory and then I hit break, it's probably going to break me in some kind of just weird area of the code in a kind of a polling loop and an interrupt or something that's running a timer. So I have to be very lucky to hit the exact spot where it's doing the processing of the menu. That's not a good way to operate. What I need to have some kind of trigger, some kind of trap that when it gets tripped and breaks, it's going to be guaranteed to be in the inventory screen. And what I figured out was, okay, well, when you enter the inventory, it's got to read all the character attributes. So if I do a watch point on the attributes and then I enter the inventory, it's going to hit when it's loading all those attributes for the inventory. And so you can see here, I've actually already charted that out. That's just inventory loading function here. So now what I do is I figure out, okay, so who calls inventory loading? And you can find that by stepping over and stepping out, or you can also do a trace, and then you can see what path led up to the point of the breakpoint. But either way you do it, you find out that the function that's calling it is inventory entry. So this is the one and I figure out this was the one that gets called when you open the inventory. So what I tried, first of all, I tried just hacking a call into this code from one of my extension functions. So when you do a melee attack, it would call this function. I wanted to see what would happen. And what happens is it actually opens up the inventory, it shows you, and it stays in inventory mode. So this function, it blocks until you finish in the inventory. So it's a self-contained game loop in here. And that's actually very convenient. So it means that anywhere I want, I could call this function and immediately go into the inventory. And then when I'm done, they press start or whatever, I'm finished, I leave this function, it'll go back to wherever it came from. Now what I found was that when it goes back, the screen just goes black. But if you press start, it goes into the menu. And if you press start again, it goes back to the game mode. So it does return to the game mode. The game mode is working. It accepts inputs. But the graphics mode has not been set up. So I know that, all right, so jumping immediately, returning from inventory mode, let me just show you here. Going immediately from inventory mode, from this mode, back into the tactical mode is no good. Something about the transition from the menu into the tactical mode is where the special sauce was. So I traced through that, and I found out that it's not in the return, it's not in the code in inventory before, not inventory, I get inventory and menu mixed up so much. It's annoying. It's not in the code right before you return from the menu. It's in the code after you return from menu. So the tactical code, let me show you. So here's the combat loop for tactical, and in here it reads buttons, reads the state of the buttons, and it does some stuff here. It's going to check for start, and if the start button is pressed, it calls menu tactical thunk 2, and this goes into that the menu mode, right? When it eventually returns from the menu mode, when you exit the menu, these are the functions that it executes to return the graphics back into tactical graphics. So you got to call this one and this one and this one, and it's just what you got to do. So once I figured that out, all I need to do now is when I want to enter quote-unquote spellbook mode, I call the entry into the inventory, and when I leave the inventory, then I have to call these bad boys to get us back into tactical graphics mode. So that's the first piece of the puzzle, how to enter and exit the inventory. The second piece is, okay, so how do I hook the input in order to enter that? What I want to do is when the user presses the action button, I want to check to see if that slot is empty, and if so, I want to then execute my own thing to, jump directly into inventory, into spellbook mode as I call it. So what I had to do is basically reverse engineer the tactical combat loop. It's going to read the buttons. By the way, the button bits are set up like this. So every button has its own bit. Now I excavated a lot of code from here. So the logic it's been transplanted. But basically what it did was it took those button states and it used that as a lookup into one of these two tables, depending on whether the D-pad was being pressed or ABC start buttons were being pressed. And depending on the state of those buttons, it looked up into this value, and then it returns from this loop when you hit one of those buttons. So in this loop, it's either going to be one of two things. It's going to enter the menu, or it is going to return, in which case some kind of action will be executed. You'll move your character, or you'll activate one of your slots. So this loop doesn't actually do the game processing. It only is handling input, basically. I should really rename it to tactical input loop, but whatever. Doesn't matter. What does matter is that I moved all that functionality into Hook Tactical Spellbook. So you can see I replicated those two tables in here, and what I'm going to do in Hook Tactical Spellbook, I'm going to take in the joy state in D0. I'm going to check if it was a press on the D-pad. If so, I just return the lookup into this table where you mask out the top bits, and whatever the bottom 4 bits are, that's a lookup into this 16 element table. And that'll be returned from here, and then that will then return from this function, and it'll execute whatever it normally executes. So that's one possibility. Now, otherwise it's got to be a button press, because the only way we enter this function is if something was pressed. So if it's a button press, first of all, we just figure out which character sheet is active, because that'll be useful to us. And then if the button press was B and slot B is empty, that means we're doing our spellbook. So I have a global flag. I added my first global variable, put it into the SRAM, just like I said, the battery backup SRAM. And this one, well, the way I did it is I made all the globals into a single structure. And then, so it's in that globals structure, there is spellbook flag. And it's an enumeration, and I set it to the flag value inventory active. So this is a flag telling us that the spellbook inventory is active. This is important because the spellbook code checks this to determine how it should behave. Not the spellbook code, the inventory code. Because the inventory, you can enter it from normal way and it should behave normally. Or you can enter it from the spellbook ability and then it should behave in the spellbook mode. So this is what allows us to communicate that. What else? Sheet index, that's just the selected character. So you have to put the address of the selected sheet into A0 before you call enter inventory, because that's to know which character sheet is selected when you enter the inventory. And once you call this, it's going to enter into the inventory mode and it will not return until you're finished with the inventory. And when you return, it's calling those functions that I showed you. So fade out menu, fade in tactical. It's got to put this value into A0 and then it calls this function. I don't know what any of these functions do. All I know is that I have to call them, otherwise the graphics doesn't go back. That's all I know. That's all I need to know. Now, we can check this global flag and it'll have a value in there that'll tell us what happened, what is the result of the spellbook action, right? So if the action means that they selected a spell, they didn't just exit out, they didn't cancel, they selected something, then what I'm going to do is I am going to return the action in the table here, the lookup table, that means execute whatever is bound to that slot. So when they select something, it should automatically execute, saves you a button press. Also, the return from this is another signal separate from the global variable. And basically, if it's FF, that means don't do anything. But if it's anything other than FF, that means return from this function with that value, because that's going to be the command that needs to be executed. So there you have it. Otherwise, if it's not my special case, then just, return the lookup as usual, as you would normally do. So there you have my hook into the tactical input loop that gets me from there into the spellbook. So in the inventory entry function, where all the inventory stuff is kind of retained until you exit your inventory, here, let me find it. Here is where the actual equipping of the item would take place. And what we're going to do here is we replace that logic with our own hook. So func spellbook equip hook. So that's this function here. We're taking in three things, D0, D2, A4. We have the offset as a number of bytes from the beginning of the character sheet in D0. That's the offset of the slot. So it's going to be one of two values, very close. Those two values are going to be either 1E or 1F. We have which card was selected to equip in D2, and we have a pointer to the character sheet that we're working with in A4. So what we're going to do is first we check our global. Are we in spellbook mode? Because if not, we're just going to equip. We're going to clear that global flag. I don't know if this is actually necessary, but just in case, we're going to make sure it's cleared. And then we're going to return a 0, which means just proceed as usual, like just don't do anything weird. But if we were in spellbook mode, we're going to equip, but we're going to set that spellbook flag to be spell selected, so that when we finally return from our entry into spellbook mode, we'll pick that up and we'll be able to tell the game to activate the thing that was just equipped. And this just has a nice helper function in here. It's not exported, where I can just check the offset and that determines, which slot I should assign to, basically. Because I want to use my P sheet member variables instead of using this offset. I like it better. Anyways, simple function. Now there's one other little wrinkle that I wanted to add. So if you're in spellbook mode, I wanted to restrict what you're able to do. I don't want you to be able to switch to different characters. You're only there to select a spell for the currently active character. So I basically want to disable the C button, and I also want to disable A button, because the only place where you should be able to equip is into your quote-unquote spellbook slot, which is button B. So I disable button A and C by hooking the existing code with my own inventory gamepad hook. So I have to call this function because that's what they do in the original code, and I had to remove enough things from their code to give me space enough to do a long jump. So I have to often excavate extra things and put them in here in order to get enough space to install my hook. But so I call this function because I have to. Then I call load button bits to get the pad state. And then if I am in Spellbook mode, I just want to remove buttons A and C from that pad state and then return it. Yeah, this is annoying. It looks like for some reason, that hook is not installed anymore. So I must have reverted a change where I had installed it, because look, I can switch characters in Spellbook mode and I can equip to the first slot. Oh, that's weird. Yeah, that's not the way it's supposed to work. Yeah, sometimes I'm a little overzealous in my git discard changes. So let's see here, inventory gamepad hook. So it's calling this function here, inventory function before button. I don't know if I've also reverted the change where I named that, but inventory function before button is OX614C. Okay, so apparently this is still named the way I named it. It's called twice from inventory entry. So here we're loading button bits, and also here, and I don't think it's this one, because right after we call this one, we call this timer function, which I don't know what it does, but I originally found it in experience stuff, but it's all over the place. So let me see here. So it's probably this one, and what I gotta do is excavate. I can put my long call into here plus a no-op, and that'll fit. So it's already imported. All I need to do, jump to subroutine ext. Let's find my thunk. It should be inventory gamepad hook. Yes, long, booyah. And then you are now a no-op. Okay, so this should fix it. Let me just try to export this quick. All right, we're back in the thick of it here. Nice easy battle for us. Put this boy to sleep. Nighty night. And now if I go back here. Okay, so I go into menu here. Let me press the button to cycle characters. It is not cycling. Let me press the button to equip slot A. It is not equipping, but I can equip slot B. And that will automatically activate it, and booyah. Okay, so yeah, that got removed somehow, but yeah, it's back in there now, so no harm, no foul. While I'm in the neighborhood here is where I set up the globals that are gonna go into the battery backup SRAM. So I create a struct, and I'm gonna put all my globals in the single struct. And then I define globals G as a global variable. Now, it's interesting because I have these other globals here. They go into my extension ROM, but this one has to go into the SRAM memory region. So how do I control that? Well, in my linker script, I've got the text section, that goes into extension ROM. I have read-only data, that goes into the extension ROM. That is, so everything I put that's const, basically, will go into here. And then I have BSS, which is uninitialized globals, basically. And I put them in SRAM. So I defined another memory region, SRAM, that starts at this address, and there you go. There's where the magic happens. So previously BSS, I think I actually had it in the discard, telling it not to use that. So I pulled it out of there, and now I had this one just as data. So I specify RO data, read-only data goes in the ROM, BSS goes in the SRAM, everything else is discarded. But this is nice. Now I have this global here, and what I do is I have a hook that I call along with other game initialization, just initialization of the standard game code. And I have a hook in here that tells it, call this one, and just initialize my global variable like this. Yeah, if I click that here, and then I figure out where that's being called from. Yeah, at the very beginning of memory, these routines are called when you boot up. So I found just a couple, I think it was like some no-ops in here, and I was like, hey, sweet, 3 no-ops. I'm just going to use that memory to call my initialized globals. It was beautiful space carved out for me already. And this is called when you boot up the ROM, and very, very good. So that is basically the tactical side of things. Now, unfortunately, unlike stuff like melee calculations, changing this code does nothing for the dungeon. The dungeon is a completely different system. They both use the same inventory, which is nice, the same code for the inventory, but the way you get there is completely different. They have different game loops. It makes sense. It's a completely different mode. So I had to figure out how to do that one, and that one was way harder than the tactical one. Like, look at all these notes that I'm taking here. Most of this was just stuff I was trying to figure out how to get the dungeon mode hooks working. So let me just quickly show you what I did there, if I can remember. I mean, if we work backwards, there's 2 additional hooks. There's Dungeon Spellbook hook, which I guess gets called when you press button B. It's going to check to see if slot 2 is empty. If so, it's going to enter inventory. If it's not empty, it's just going to do what it was doing before, which was put this into this global, because that's what it was doing in the original code, and put this value into D0 and then call this function and then return 0. There you go. So it's going to return, this return value is going to tell you whether we did Spellbook or whether we did normal shit. So this one was installed. Let's figure out where we installed it. Yeah, so you can see what's happening here. D7 contains the state of the gamepad. We're testing bit 6, which is button A. And if it's not set, then we skip to here and check the next button. It's doing this in chain, saying A, B, C. It checks start, does all these things, right? Now, if button A was pressed, it's going to move a value into D0. It's going to move a value into some global. It's going to call this function. You saw that in my C++ code. And then it's going to branch to this thing that it does after you do an action, which is it cycles the character to the next one, basically. In our check button B, we check to see if the button was pressed. If not, we skip. If it was pressed, we execute our hook. And then the return value from our hook is going to tell us what to do. So either action was done, just normal shit happened, in which case you just do the normal consequences. Or if we entered the inventory, we have to recover from menu. So we have to do the stuff that you normally do after you return from the main menu. So that's this stuff in here. So this is what happens if you press the start button, you enter the menu. And then when you return from this, you do all the stuff to restore the graphics. And we're reusing all these calls because there's a lot of them. There's a lot more than there are in Tactical. And I didn't want to put all these into my C++ code. So I just reuse them from here, basically. And it works nice. Works good. So that's like the first part of the equation. Now, what is the other hook that I created? The Dungeon Gamepad hook. So after you do the stuff in the spellbook, if you select a spell, you actually have to execute it, you have to do that in the next iteration of the loop. So in this global, we're remembering that you selected a spell and it has to be executed. And then after, let me see here. So after you do this recover from menu shit, where you're going to eventually branch back to the top of the loop. Yeah, loop next iteration. And then up in here is where you are basically checking for buttons to be pressed. And if they are pressed, you do some action. So what we want to do here is insert a hook. And what that hook does, it checks if a spell was selected in the last iteration. If you open the spellbook and selected a spell. And if that's the case, clear that and just say that the button currently being pressed is button B. So overwrite whatever is actually being pressed and say, no, that shit is B, because you got to execute the thing that was just equipped. And that's what we do. Now, to do this, I had to excavate extra functions to make space. So I excavated a function called this dungeon loop thing, because I don't know what the hell it is. I just know that it's called. So I have to call that function with 0 in D0 and 1 in D1. Now here's the thing. If I have to call a function and put things into 2 registers from C++ code, that don't work so well. So what I do if I only have to put a thing in 1 register, I have this macro called register arg A for address register. And what it does, if we go to the definition, it just does ASM volatile and it moves whatever is here, it moves that into the register. And that works fine for a single register. But what happens if I do that for 2 registers? The second one can actually use the first register and overwrite what I just put in there. So it's no good. I can't just do it like that. I have to do it all in a single contiguous ASM block to make sure the compiler doesn't mess up my registers. And so that's why I had to create this function, which just has some ASM to set up the registers and then call the function. And I can't call it directly with the address. I I have to move it into an address register and then call it. I don't know. It's just bullshit with the inline assembly. So whatever. That's how that works. It was fun debugging this one, by the way. It was a lot of fun. But there you have it. Now, just for completeness sake, let me show you how that works in the dungeon. So I've got my magic user here. They currently do not have a spell equipped, which would be annoying, especially in the dungeon mode. But here, booyah! Press the button, automatically take me to my menu here, equip my spell, and automatically use it, kill that rat. Beautiful. And yeah, I mean, there's still some improvements could be made. Like, for example, you have no way of unequipping something once it's equipped. So I would like to sometimes clear a slot so I can use my spellbook functionality right away. But it's not so easy. I have to use the thing that's in that slot first to make it empty. So it'd be nice to have an unequip. It would also be nice. It'd also be nice when I open my spellbook if it automatically selected the spells down here instead of having to go down first. But that's a small thing, right? So I'm not going to worry about it. The functionality that I've added is a pretty huge quality of life improvement. And it's great. Now, in the next video, I'm going to show you one more quality of life improvement that was a lot simpler to implement. But until then, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please click the like button. It helps a lot. And I will see you again with some more ROM hacking.